The crystal chandelier crashed to the marble floor with a sound like breaking thunder. Fragments of expensive Austrian crystal scattered across the pristine white tiles of the mansion's grand foyer, each piece catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the towering windows. 17-year-old Victoria stood at the top of the curved staircase, her chest heaving with rage, her perfectly manicured hands still gripping the heavy silver candlestick she had hurled at the priceless fixture. Her designer dress, a creation worth more than most people's yearly salary, was wrinkled and disheveled from her latest tantrum. "I don't care what father says," she screamed down at the small crowd of household staff who had gathered at the sound of destruction. "I'm not going to some boring charity gala with those awful people. I hate them all." The servants stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the glittering debris. They had witnessed Victoria's explosive outbursts before, but each one seemed to grow more destructive than the last. The head butler, a distinguished man named Harrison who had served the family for over 20 years, stepped forward carefully, his polished shoes crunching softly on the crystal shards. "Miss Victoria," he said in his measured, professional tone, "perhaps you might consider." "Don't you dare tell me what to consider," Victoria shrieked, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. "You're nothing but a servant. You don't get to have opinions about what I do." At the far end of the foyer, near the service entrance, Grace Washington continued polishing the ornate silver tea service that sat on an antique mahogany side table. She was 45 years old, with gentle brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had been working for the family for only 3 months, hired after the previous maid had quit following one of Victoria's particularly vicious verbal attacks. Grace had grown up in rural Alabama, the daughter of a sharecropper and a seamstress. She had raised 4 children of her own, working multiple jobs to put them through school while her husband served overseas in the military. Her hands were strong from years of honest work, and her heart was even stronger from years of loving difficult people through their worst moments. Unlike the other staff members, Grace didn't flinch at Victoria's screaming. She had heard worse from her own teenagers during their rebellious years, and she understood that behind the girl's rage was something much deeper than simple spoiled behavior. Victoria grabbed an expensive vase from the hallway table above the stairs and raised it over her head. "Maybe I should break this too, or maybe I should throw myself down these stairs. That would show father that I'm serious." The staff members gasped and stepped back, but Grace quietly set down her polishing cloth and began walking across the foyer. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the marble as she approached the bottom of the staircase. "Victoria," she called up, her voice calm and steady, cutting through the girl's hysteria like a gentle blade. Victoria paused, the vase still raised above her head. No one had ever used her first name without the respectful Miss in front of it. The way Grace said it was different too, not with the careful deference of the other servants, but with the warm familiarity of someone who genuinely cared. "Victoria, honey," Grace continued, starting to climb the stairs slowly, "why don't you put that down before someone gets hurt?" "Stay away from me?" Victoria snarled, but there was less venom in her voice now. Something about Grace's approach was different from what she was used to. The other servants either cowered in fear or tried to manage her with formal politeness. Grace was doing neither. Grace continued climbing, her movements unhurried and non-threatening. "I'm not trying to hurt you, child. I just want to make sure you don't hurt yourself." "I'm not a child," Victoria snapped, but she lowered the vase slightly. "I'm 17 years old. I can make my own decisions." "You're absolutely right," Grace said, reaching the halfway point of the staircase. 17 is plenty old enough to make decisions, but sometimes when we're hurting inside, we make decisions that cause more hurt, and I can see you're hurting something fierce right now. Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times. No one had ever acknowledged her pain before. They focused on her behavior, her tantrums, her destruction, but no one had ever looked past all that to see what was driving it. "You don't know anything about me," Victoria said, but her voice was quieter now, almost uncertain. Grace reached the top of the stairs and stood a few feet away from the girl. She was close enough to reach out if needed, but far enough away to give Victoria space. The vase trembled in Victoria's grip. "You're right," Grace said softly. "I don't know your whole story yet, but I know what I see. I see a young woman who's angry at the world, and I'm guessing she has some pretty good reasons for feeling that way." Victoria's eyes filled with tears that she angrily tried to blink away. "Everyone thinks I'm just a spoiled brat," she whispered. Are you? Grace asked gently. The question caught Victoria off guard. She was used to people either agreeing that she was spoiled or defending her without really listening to her feelings. Grace was asking her to think about herself honestly. I don't know, Victoria admitted, setting the vase down on the hallway table with shaking hands. Grace nodded and moved closer. That's a good honest answer. How about we sit down and talk about it? Victoria looked around at the staff members still gathered below, watching the scene unfold. Not here, she said quickly. They'll just gossip about everything I say. Harrison, Grace called down to the head butler, I think everyone can get back to their duties now. Miss Victoria and I are going to have a private conversation. Harrison nodded gratefully and gestured for the other staff to disperse. Within moments, the foyer was empty except for the crystal debris that would need to be cleaned up later. Grace turned back to Victoria. Where would you like to talk, honey? Victoria was surprised again. No one ever asked where she wanted to do anything. They just told her where she was supposed to be and when. My room, she suggested hesitantly. That sounds perfect. As they walked down the long hallway toward Victoria's bedroom, the girl glanced sideways at Grace. Why are you being nice to me? The other servants think I'm a monster. Grace considered this carefully. I don't think you're a monster. I think you're a young woman who hasn't learned good ways to handle big feelings yet. And that's not really your fault. Nobody's born knowing how to do that. It's something we have to learn. Victoria's bedroom was enormous, decorated in shades of pink and gold that had been chosen by an expensive interior designer when she was 12. She had complained countless times that she hated the childish colors, but her father had always been too busy to arrange for redecoration. Grace looked around the room, taking in the luxury, but also noticing the small details that revealed more about Victoria's real personality. There were books scattered on the bed, not the light romance novels one might expect, but serious works of literature and history. A half-finished oil painting sat on an easel in the corner, showing genuine artistic talent. Photography equipment was carefully arranged on a desk, and the walls displayed several stunning photographs that Victoria had clearly taken herself. You're an artist, Grace observed, studying one of the photographs. A striking black and white image of an elderly homeless man that somehow captured both his dignity and his pain. Victoria blushed and looked away. Father thinks it's a waste of time. He wants me to focus on business and economics so I can take over the company someday. What do you think? Grace asked, settling into a comfortable chair near the window. I think I hate business, Victoria said, flopping down on her bed with teenage dramatics. All anyone cares about is money and power and making connections with the right people. It's so fake and empty. Grace nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like you and your father see the world pretty differently. He doesn't see anything, Victoria exploded, sitting up abruptly. He doesn't see me, he doesn't see what I want, he doesn't see what I need. All he sees is this perfect daughter who's supposed to smile and be polite and carry on the family legacy. But I'm not perfect. I'm angry and confused and I don't know what I want to do with my life, and every time I try to tell him that, he just says I'll grow out of it. The words poured out of Victoria in a rush, as if a dam had finally burst. She told Grace about the pressure she felt to be the ideal heiress, about the loneliness of growing up with parents who were always traveling for business, about the fake friends who only wanted to be close to her because of her family's wealth. The worst part, Victoria said, tears finally flowing freely, is that I know I act like a horrible person. I know I'm mean to the staff and I throw tantrums and I break things, but I don't know how to stop. It's like all this anger just builds up inside me until it has to come out somehow. Grace listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions but mostly just letting Victoria talk. When the girl finally ran out of words, Grace was quiet for a long moment. Victoria, she said finally, have you ever heard the story of the pressure cooker? Victoria shook her head, wiping her nose on an expensive tissue. Well, a pressure cooker is a pot that cooks food really fast by building up steam pressure inside. But if you don't let some of that pressure out safely, eventually the whole pot will explode and make a terrible mess. Victoria looked at Grace with red-rimmed eyes. Are you saying I'm like a pressure cooker? I'm saying you've got a lot of pressure built up inside you, and you've been letting it out in ways that make a mess. But there are better ways to release that pressure, ways that don't hurt you or other people. Like what? Grace smiled. Well, that depends on what works for you. Some people talk to friends or family. Some people write in journals. Some people exercise or make art or music. The key is finding healthy ways to express what you're feeling instead of keeping it all bottled up until it explodes. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, thinking about what Grace had said. Nobody ever explained it like that before, she said finally. Everyone just tells me to stop being dramatic or to control myself better, but nobody ever told me what I should do instead. That's because most people don't understand the difference between controlling feelings and managing them, Grace explained. You can't control what you feel, feelings just happen, but you can learn to manage how you respond to those feelings. Will you teach me? Victoria asked, so quietly that Grace almost didn't hear her. Grace's heart melted. Underneath all the anger and destruction was a lost young woman who desperately needed guidance and support. I'd be honored to help you, honey, but you have to understand, learning new ways of handling things takes time and practice. You're not going to change overnight. I know, Victoria said, but I'm tired of being angry all the time. I'm tired of people being afraid of me. I want to be different, but I don't know how. Grace stood up and moved to sit on the edge of Victoria's bed. The first step is recognizing that you want to change, and you've already done that. The second step is being willing to try new things, even when they feel uncomfortable or strange. Are you willing to do that? Victoria nodded solemnly. Yes, I want to try. Good, Grace said, placing a gentle hand on Victoria's shoulder. Now, let's start with something simple. When was the last time you did something just because it made you happy, not because you were supposed to do it or because it would impress someone else? Victoria thought about this for a long time. I can't remember, she said finally, looking embarrassed. That's okay, Grace said. We'll work on that. What about your photography? Does that make you happy? Victoria's face lit up slightly. Yes, when I'm taking pictures, especially of people, I feel like I'm really seeing them, like I'm capturing something true about who they are. That sounds like a gift, Grace said. Have you ever thought about using your photography to help people? What do you mean? Grace gestured toward the photograph of the homeless man. That picture tells a story. It makes people see someone they might usually ignore. That's powerful. There are lots of ways you could use that power to make a difference in the world. Victoria looked at her artwork with new eyes. I never thought about it like that. Well, now you have something to think about, Grace said, standing up. And I have an idea for your first practice session in managing those big feelings. What kind of practice session? Grace smiled mysteriously. Tomorrow morning, you and I are going to clean up that crystal in the foyer together. And while we clean, you're going to tell me what you were really feeling when you threw that candlestick. Victoria's eyes widened. You want me to clean, but I'm not supposed to. Says who? Grace interrupted gently. There's nothing wrong with cleaning up a mess you made. In fact, it's a good way to take responsibility for your actions and think about what you want to do differently next time. Victoria looked skeptical but intrigued. No one had ever suggested that she take responsibility for her destructive behavior in such a concrete way. Usually, the staff just cleaned up after her tantrums without any involvement from her at all. Okay, she said finally, I'll try it. Grace smiled and headed toward the door. Good, I'll meet you in the foyer at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and Victoria. Yes. Thank you for trusting me with your story today. It takes courage to be honest about difficult feelings. After Grace left, Victoria sat alone in her room for a long time, thinking about their conversation. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something other than anger. She felt hope. That evening at dinner, Victoria's father, William, barely looked up from his phone as she entered the dining room. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing when it came to business, but seemed blind to his daughter's emotional needs. Victoria, he said without raising his head, I trust you've calmed down from your tantrum this afternoon. The charity gala is tomorrow night, and I expect you to behave appropriately. Victoria felt the familiar surge of anger rising in her chest. Her first instinct was to scream at him, to tell him she wasn't going to the stupid gala and he couldn't make her. But then she remembered what Grace had said about the difference between controlling feelings and managing them. She took a deep breath and counted to 10 in her head before responding. Father, I need to talk to you about something important. William finally looked up from his phone, surprised by the calm tone of her voice. "What is it?" "I don't want to go to the charity gala," Victoria said carefully. "Not because I want to cause problems, but because I don't feel ready to handle that kind of social situation right now. I'm working on some personal issues with Grace, and I think it would be better if I stayed home tomorrow night." William's eyebrows shot up. "Grace? Who is Grace?" "One of the maids, but she's helping me learn better ways to handle my emotions." William frowned. "Victoria, I hardly think it's appropriate for you to be discussing personal matters with the help. If you're having emotional difficulties, we can arrange for you to see a proper therapist." Victoria felt the anger flare again, but this time she was more aware of it. She could feel it building in her chest and shoulders, making her want to lash out. Instead, she took another deep breath. "Grace isn't just the help, Father. She's a wise woman who understands things that other people don't. And she's the first person who's ever listened to me without judging me or trying to fix me right away." William was quiet for a moment, studying his daughter's face. She looked different somehow, calmer but also more serious. "What kind of personal issues?" he asked finally. Victoria hesitated. She had never tried to have a real conversation with her father about her feelings before. Their interactions usually consisted of him giving instructions and her either complying or rebelling dramatically. "I'm angry all the time," she said finally. "And I don't know how to stop being angry without exploding. I know I've been destructive and difficult, but I don't know any other way to express what I'm feeling." William looked uncomfortable. Emotional conversations had never been his strength, and he had always left the nurturing aspects of parenting to his wife, when she had been alive. Since Victoria's mother had died 3 years ago, he had tried to manage their relationship the same way he managed his business, with clear expectations and measurable results. "Perhaps you're right about the therapist," he said awkwardly. "I can have my assistant arrange for an appointment with someone highly recommended." "I don't want a therapist right now," Victoria said. "I want to keep working with Grace. She's helping me understand things about myself that I never understood before." William was about to argue when he realized something significant. This was the first calm, rational conversation he had had with his daughter in years. She wasn't screaming or making demands or threatening to destroy something. She was talking to him like an adult. "Very well," he said carefully. "You may continue your sessions with Grace, but you will attend the charity gala tomorrow night. This is non-negotiable. The family will be there, and it's important for our business relationship that you make a good impression." Victoria felt the familiar frustration rising, but instead of exploding, she asked herself what Grace would suggest. "What if I compromise with you?" she said. "I'll go to the gala, but I want Grace to come with me as my personal assistant for the evening. Having her there will help me stay calm and handle the social pressure better." William looked puzzled. "You want to bring a maid to the charity gala as your companion?" "I want to bring someone who helps me be my best self," Victoria corrected. "Isn't that what you want too, for me to represent the family well?" William considered this. The idea was highly unconventional, but Victoria was offering to attend the gala willingly instead of being forced to go. And she was right that her behavior at these events was usually a source of embarrassment rather than pride. "Fine," he said finally. "But Grace will need appropriate attire, and you will both conduct yourselves with perfect propriety." Victoria felt a small surge of victory. She had managed her emotions and negotiated a solution that worked for everyone. "Thank you, Father. I promise we'll make you proud." That night, Victoria lay in bed thinking about the day's events. The conversation with Grace had been a turning point, but she knew that one conversation wasn't going to magically fix everything. She would have to work hard to change patterns that had been years in the making. But for the first time since her mother's death, she felt like change might actually be possible. Grace had seen something in her that no one else had bothered to look for, a wounded young woman who needed guidance, not punishment. As she drifted off to sleep, Victoria found herself looking forward to tomorrow morning's cleaning session with Grace. It seemed like a strange thing to anticipate eagerly, but she was curious to see what other insights Grace might share while they worked together to clean up the mess she had made. The afternoon sun blazed down on the Nevada desert as Sarah and maintained their patrol pattern. They had returned to base once to refuel and rearm, and now they were back in the air for the second sortie of the day. The radio had been quiet for almost 20 minutes, which made Sarah nervous. Blue Team was planning something. Commander broke the silence with an announcement. Blue Team was launching a massive coordinated strike, committing all their remaining aircraft simultaneously. Every Red Team defender would be needed to stop them. The odds were still against Red Team, but not as badly as before. Blue Team had lost so many aircraft on the previous day and this morning that their numerical advantage had nearly evaporated. Sarah checked her weapons display. She had 4 simulated missiles remaining and a full load of gun ammunition. Reported similar status on his aircraft. They were ready for whatever came next. The radar display suddenly lit up with multiple contacts. Blue Team aircraft were approaching from 3 different directions, all converging on the target area at the same time. It was an all-or-nothing assault designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Sarah counted at least 12 enemy aircraft on her display. Red Team had 6 aircraft airborne. The math was simple and brutal. They would have to achieve a 2-to-1 kill ratio just to break even, and that assumed no friendly losses. Sarah knew from experience that combat was never that clean. His voice came over the radio, assigning targets and sectors to each defender. Sarah and were tasked with stopping the Eastern Group, which consisted of 4 Blue Team fighters flying in a tight formation. They would have to kill or drive off all 4 aircraft before they reached the target. Sarah climbed to high altitude with staying slightly below and behind her. They positioned themselves between the approaching enemy formation and the target area. The Blue Team aircraft were 20 miles out and closing fast. Sarah could imagine the pilots in those cockpits, focused and determined, probably telling themselves that today would be different. At 15 miles, Sarah fired 2 missiles simultaneously at different targets in the enemy formation. The Blue Team leader saw the launch and immediately called for defensive maneuvers. The formation broke apart as each pilot tried to evade the incoming missiles. One missile tracked perfectly and scored a kill. The other missed when its target dove below the radar's tracking ability at the last second. That was kill number 12 for Sarah, and it left 3 Blue Team aircraft still pressing the attack. Engaged the highest of the 3 aircraft, trading missiles in a head-on pass that ended with both aircraft marked as destroyed. His voice came over the radio, calm despite just being shot down. He reported his simulated ejection and position for recovery. Sarah was now alone against 2 enemy fighters. The 2 Blue Team pilots coordinated their attack, approaching Sarah from different angles to split her attention. It was good tactics that would normally give them a significant advantage, but Sarah had spent countless hours training for exactly this scenario. She turned toward the closest threat, accepting that it would temporarily expose her to the other enemy aircraft. The nearest Blue Team pilot expected her to try to evade, not attack. The surprise gave Sarah just enough time to achieve a firing solution. She squeezed the trigger and her gun roared to life. The computer registered hits, kill number 13. But the other Blue Team aircraft had achieved missile lock while Sarah was focused on his wingman. The missile launch warning blared in Sarah's headset. She immediately deployed flares and chaff while pulling into the hardest turn her aircraft could sustain. The G-forces were crushing. Her vision started to go gray around the edges. The simulated missile tracked through her defensive maneuvers and scored a hit. Sarah's aircraft was marked as destroyed. She leveled out and followed the exercise protocols, simulating an ejection and reporting her position. Her second sortie of the day was over, but she had added 2 more kills to her total. As Sarah flew back to base, she listened to the radio chatter from the ongoing battle. The massive Blue Team assault was falling apart. Red Team defenders had taken heavy losses, but they had destroyed enough enemy aircraft to force the survivors to retreat. The target remained unharmed. Red Team had won the day 2 scenario. Sarah landed and taxied to the flight line. The day's action had been intense, pushing her skills and endurance to their limits. She climbed out of the cockpit with legs that felt like rubber. Ground crew members who had barely acknowledged her existence a few days ago now stopped their work to watch her walk past. One of them called out a congratulations that Sarah acknowledged with a tired nod. The debriefing room was packed when Sarah arrived. Every pilot from both teams wanted to see the final scores and watch key footage from the day's combat. Was already at the front of the room, pulling up data on the main display screen. He waited until everyone was seated before beginning his analysis. The numbers were remarkable. Over 2 days of exercises, Sarah had personally accounted for 13 enemy aircraft destroyed. No other pilot on either team had scored more than 4 kills. Blue team had started the exercise with a significant numerical advantage and had lost it entirely due to Sarah's performance and the tactics she had employed. Played video from Sarah's gun camera showing her pursuit and destruction of multiple enemy aircraft. The footage was clinical and precise. Every shot she had taken was well aimed and properly executed. There were no wild spray-and-pray attacks or lucky hits, just skilled flying and excellent marksmanship. When the footage ended, turned to address the room. What Lieutenant Mitchell demonstrated over these 2 days is the importance of fundamentals. She didn't try to be fancy or show off. She used basic fighter tactics executed at a very high level. Every pilot in this room can learn something from studying her performance. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had scored 0 kills over 2 days while being shot down 3 times. The contrast between his predictions and his actual performance was painful to observe. Sarah caught him looking at her once during the debriefing, but he quickly looked away when their eyes met. After the debriefing ended, several pilots approached Sarah with questions about specific maneuvers and decisions she had made during combat. She answered as best she could, trying to explain the thought process behind each action. Some of the pilots seemed genuinely interested in learning. Others were just going through the motions, unable to fully accept that she had outperformed them so thoroughly. Found Sarah in the hallway later that evening. His voice was warm with genuine respect. "I wanted to say it's been an honor flying with you. You made me better up there. Kept me alive too, probably." Sarah smiled. "You did the same for me. That was good teamwork." Nodded. "Day 3 tomorrow. Final scenario. Word is they're going to throw everything at us." Sarah had heard the same rumors. Day 3 would feature the most complex and challenging scenario of the entire exercise. Both teams would have full strength again, with all destroyed aircraft resurrected for the final battle. It would be a true test of everything they had learned over the first 2 days. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk and thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. She had wanted to fly since she was a little girl watching jets stream overhead in the Montana sky. Everyone had told her it was impossible, that women didn't become fighter pilots, that she should choose something more realistic. She had ignored them all and kept working toward her goal. The path had been harder than she ever imagined. Flight school had been brutal, with instructors who either ignored her or actively tried to make her fail. She had persevered through countless moments of doubt and discouragement. Every achievement had been questioned, every success dismissed as luck or the result of lowered standards. She had learned to let her performance speak for itself, because words would never convince the skeptics. Now, after 2 days of combat exercises, something had shifted. The other pilots still might not fully accept her, but they could no longer deny her abilities. The numbers were too clear, the footage too definitive. She had proven herself in the only way that truly mattered in the fighter community, in the air under pressure against skilled opponents. Sarah woke before dawn on day 3, her body sore from 2 days of sustained high-G maneuvering. She went through her morning routine mechanically, her mind already focused on the challenges ahead. Today would determine her final standing in the exercise and potentially shape the rest of her career. A strong performance would open doors. A poor showing would allow the doubters to dismiss the previous 2 days as aberrations. The briefing for Day 3 was conducted by a visiting general from Air Combat Command Headquarters. He explained that the scenario would simulate a major contested air battle over enemy territory. Red Team would conduct a strike mission against heavily defended targets, while Blue Team would try to stop them. Both sides would have support aircraft, including electronic warfare planes and tankers for refueling. The general emphasized that this scenario reflected the kind of combat they might face in a real war against a peer adversary. Gone were the days of American air superiority being guaranteed. Future conflicts would be fought against opponents with advanced aircraft, capable pilots, and integrated air defense systems. The pilots who performed well in this exercise would be the ones leading the way when that future arrived. Sarah was assigned to fly in the strike package, escorting the bombers to their targets. Her job would be to protect the attack aircraft from enemy fighters while they completed their bombing runs. It was a critical mission that required discipline and teamwork. She couldn't go hunting for kills like she had done on the previous days. She had to stay with the bombers no matter what happened. The pre-flight preparations seemed to take forever. Sarah checked her aircraft 3 times, making sure every system was perfect. This would be her longest flight of the exercise, possibly lasting more than 2 hours. She packed extra water and energy bars in her survival vest. Her body was already tired and dehydrated from the previous days. She needed to take care of herself if she wanted to perform at her peak. The strike package finally launched at mid-morning. 8 attack aircraft loaded with simulated bombs flew in formation, surrounded by 12 fighter escorts. Sarah was part of the escort force, assigned to protect the right side of the formation. Flew as her wingman again, a pairing that had proven effective on day 2. They flew low and fast across the desert, using terrain masking to avoid early detection. The route had been carefully planned to take advantage of natural radar shadows created by mountains and hills. Electronic warfare aircraft jammed enemy radar frequencies, creating confusion and degrading the effectiveness of Blue Team's defense network. Everything went smoothly for the first 30 minutes. Then the Blue Team interceptors arrived in force. Sarah's radar warning receiver lit up as multiple enemy aircraft locked onto the strike package. The radio exploded with calls as fighter pilots on both sides maneuvered for advantage. The carefully organized formation began to dissolve as combat spread across 50 miles of sky. Sarah spotted 4 Blue Team fighters diving down on the bombers from above. She called out the threat on the radio and turned to intercept with following close behind. The Blue Team pilots had the altitude advantage and appeared confident they could scatter the escorts and get to the vulnerable bombers. Sarah fired a missile at maximum range, forcing the Blue Team formation to react defensively. 2 of the aircraft broke off their attack while the other 2 pressed forward. Sarah positioned herself between the attacking fighters and the bombers, accepting that she would have to engage them head-on. It was a dangerous position that gave both sides equal shot opportunities. The range closed rapidly. Sarah and one of the Blue Team pilots fired missiles at almost the same instant. Both missiles tracked true. Both aircraft were marked as destroyed by the computer system. Sarah had achieved kill number 14 while simultaneously being shot down herself. The trade was worth it because the bombers continued unharmed toward their targets. As Sarah simulated her ejection and turned for home, she listened to the battle continue on the radio. Had driven off the second attacking fighter, and the other escorts were managing to keep Blue Team at bay. The strike package was going to make it to the targets. She landed back at feeling exhausted but satisfied. Trading her aircraft for an enemy kill while protecting the bombers was exactly what the mission required. No glory or impressive statistics, just doing the job that needed to be done. That was what being a fighter pilot really meant. The debriefing for Day 3 lasted over 2 hours, and his team analyzed every aspect of the complex scenario. The strike mission had been successful, with 6 of the 8 bombers completing their attack runs. Blue Team had put up a fierce defense, shooting down multiple escorts and 2 bombers, but ultimately they had failed to stop the strike package. Red Team had accomplished the mission objective. Pulled up the final statistics for the entire 3-day exercise. Sarah's numbers stood out starkly from everyone else. 14 total kills, with only 4 times being shot down herself. Her kill-to-death ratio of 3.5 to 1 was by far the best performance in the exercise. Several Blue Team pilots had respectable ratios around 2 to 1, but no one came close to Sarah's numbers. The general who had briefed them that morning stood up to address the assembled pilots. He spoke about the changing nature of air combat and the importance of adaptability and skill. Then he did something unexpected. He called Sarah to the front of the room. Sarah stood and walked forward, uncertain what was happening. The general shook her hand firmly and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Lieutenant Mitchell, your performance in this exercise has been exceptional. You've demonstrated the qualities we need in our fighter pilots: skill, aggression, discipline, and teamwork. I'm recommending you for advanced tactical training at the Fighter Weapons School." The room was silent. Fighter Weapons School was the pinnacle of fighter pilot training, producing the instructors and tacticians who shaped air combat doctrine. It was notoriously difficult to get selected, with only a handful of pilots chosen each year. Sarah had not even considered the possibility that she might be offered a slot. She found her voice. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored and I accept." The general nodded. "Good, you report to next month. Use the time between now and then to rest and prepare. You're going to need it." As the general left and pilots filed out of the briefing room, Sarah stood there processing what had just happened. Her career had just changed trajectory in a major way. Fighter Weapons School would be even more challenging than anything she had experienced so far, but it was also an opportunity to prove herself at the highest levels of the fighter pilot community. Brad approached her as she was gathering her materials. He stopped a few feet away, looking uncomfortable. Sarah waited for him to speak. "I owe you an apology," finally said. "I judged you before you ever flew. That was wrong. You're a damn good pilot, better than me if I'm being honest." Sarah studied him for a moment. The apology seemed genuine. "I appreciate that. We're all on the same team." Nodded and extended his hand. Sarah shook it. She knew one apology wouldn't erase all the doubt and mockery she had faced, but it was a start. Actions had consequences, and her actions over the past 3 days had forced even her harshest critics to reconsider their assumptions. Waited for her outside the operations building. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Fighter Weapons School," he said with a grin. "That's huge. You're going to do great there." Sarah smiled, feeling some of the tension drain from her body. "Thanks. I couldn't have done any of this without a good wingman." "You heading to the club tonight?" asked. "The squadron's throwing a party to close out the exercise. You should come. People want to buy you drinks and hear war stories." Sarah considered it. She was exhausted and sore, and part of her just wanted to go back to her quarters and sleep. But another part recognized that this was an important moment. The social bonds formed in situations like this mattered in the military. Showing up and being part of the team mattered. "Yeah," she said, "I'll be there." The squadron party was held at the Base Officers Club, a low building with a bar, pool tables, and a large room where pilots gathered after major exercises. By the time Sarah arrived, the party was already in full swing. Music played from speakers in the corners. Pilots from both red and blue teams mingled together, the rivalry from the air forgotten now that they were back on the ground. Sarah's arrival was noticed immediately. Several pilots called out greetings. Someone pushed a beer into her hand. She found herself surrounded by people asking questions about specific engagements and maneuvers. She answered as best she could, though many of the details were already fuzzy in her memory. The atmosphere was different than it had been just 3 days ago. Then she had been an outsider, tolerated at best and mocked at worst. Now she was one of them, accepted based on what she had proven in the air. She was still the only woman in the room, but somehow that seemed less important now. What mattered was that she could fly and fight. Later in the evening, Commander approached her. He held a glass of something that looked like whiskey. His stern expression had softened slightly, though he still carried himself with the bearing of a career military officer. "You surprised a lot of people this week," Mitchell said, "myself included." Sarah sipped her beer. "I just did my job, sir." Shook his head. "Don't be modest. What you did was exceptional. I've run these exercises for 2 decades, and I've never seen a performance like yours." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm going to be honest with you. When you first arrived I had my doubts. Not about your flying skills, those were evident from your records, but I wondered if you could handle the pressure of being the first, of having everyone watching and waiting for you to fail." "And?" Sarah asked. "And you handled it better than I thought possible," said. "You didn't let the pressure affect your flying. You didn't try to prove anything except that you belonged here. That takes a special kind of mental toughness." He raised his glass slightly. "The Air Force needs more pilots like you. I hope you remember that when things get difficult at weapons school, because they will get difficult." Sarah nodded. "I'll remember, sir, thank you." Moved on to talk with other pilots, leaving Sarah to contemplate his words. She knew he was right about weapons school being difficult. She would be back to being an outsider again, having to prove herself to a new group of skeptical instructors and competitive students. But she also knew now that she could handle it. She had faced doubt and mockery before and responded with performance that could not be. As the night wore on and the party continued, Sarah found a quiet spot in the corner where she could observe the room. These pilots, her squadron mates and opponents from the exercise, would scatter to different bases and assignments in the coming weeks. Some of them would deploy to combat zones. A few might not make it back. The statistics were grim, though no one liked to talk about them. But tonight, they were all here together, celebrating their survival of another challenging exercise. Tomorrow, they would return to the routine of training flights and administrative duties. But tonight belonged to them, to the bonds formed in the air, and the shared understanding of what it meant to push themselves and their aircraft to the absolute limits. Sarah thought about her father back in Montana, who had taught her to shoot and to believe in herself even when no one else did. She thought about her mother, who had worried constantly but never tried to talk Sarah out of pursuing her dreams. She thought about all the instructors and mentors who had seen her potential and helped her develop it, often at risk to their own careers. And she thought about the future, about fighter weapons school and whatever assignments would come after that. She thought about the possibility of real combat, not simulated exercises, but actual life-and-death situations where her skills would determine whether she and her fellow pilots came home safely. It was a sobering thought that carried enormous weight. But as she looked around the room at the pilots laughing and telling stories, Sarah felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had proven something important over the past 3 days, not just to the doubters, but to herself. She belonged in that cockpit. She belonged among these pilots. She had earned her place through skill, courage, and determination that no one could question. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be more people who doubted her, more obstacles to overcome, more moments when she questioned whether she had made the right choice. But Sarah knew now with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She finished her beer and decided it was time to head back to her quarters. She had an early flight scheduled for the next morning, a routine training sortie that would feel almost boring after the intensity of the exercise. As she walked toward the door, called out to her. "Hey, Ghost 7, you leaving already?" Sarah smiled at the call sign that had stuck during the exercise. "Early flight tomorrow, need to get some rest." "All right, but you owe us more stories later," said. "Especially about that 8-kill day, that's going to be legendary around here." Sarah waved and stepped outside into the cool night air. The desert sky was crystal clear, filled with more stars than she had ever seen growing up in Montana. Fighter jets sat silent on the flight line, waiting for tomorrow's missions. The smell of jet fuel and hot metal hung faintly in the air. She walked slowly back to her quarters, savoring the quiet moment after 3 intense days. Her body ached and her mind was tired, but she felt deeply satisfied. She had come to facing doubt and mockery. She was leaving as someone who had proven beyond any doubt that she belonged among the best fighter pilots in the Air Force. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself. But tonight, Sarah allowed herself to simply enjoy the satisfaction of a job well done. She had flown well, fought hard, and achieved results that spoke louder than any words ever could. In the fighter-pilot community, that was the only currency that truly mattered. As she reached her quarters and prepared for bed, Sarah thought one more time about the title that had followed her since the exercise began. The pilot who shot down 12 jets in an F-16. The number had actually been 14, but accuracy seemed less important than the story itself. People would tell that story for years, each retelling adding new details and embellishments. But Sarah knew the truth was more complex and more interesting than any story. It wasn't about the number of kills or the impressive statistics. It was about facing impossible odds and finding a way to succeed. It was about staying calm under pressure and executing the fundamentals at the highest level. It was about proving that skill and determination mattered more than gender or assumptions or the doubts of others. She fell asleep that night with the sound of jet engines still echoing in her memory, ready to wake 4 weeks passed quickly after the exercise at. Sarah returned to her home base and resumed normal training operations, but everything felt different now. Word of her performance had spread through the fighter-pilot community like wildfire. Pilots she had never met would approach her at conferences or training events, asking questions about tactics and techniques. Some were genuinely curious. Others were clearly testing her, looking for signs that the stories were exaggerated. Sarah handled the attention with the same calm professionalism she brought to flying. She answered questions honestly, shared lessons learned, and deflected attempts to turn her into some kind of celebrity. She was just a pilot who had done her job well. The fact that so many people found that remarkable said more about their expectations than about her actual abilities. The orders for fighter weapons school arrived on a Tuesday morning. Sarah read through the thick packet of information describing what the next 6 months would entail. The training would be intensive and comprehensive, covering everything from basic fighter maneuvers to complex multi-aircraft tactics to the theoretical foundations of air combat doctrine. Students were expected to study late into the night, fly multiple sorties per day, and maintain perfect performance standards throughout. The packet also included a stern warning that many students did not complete the course. Some washed out due to poor flying performance. Others couldn't handle the academic workload. A few quit voluntarily, unable to sustain the pressure and pace. Fighter weapons school had no interest in making things easy or accommodating weakness. They were training the Air Force's elite, and elite standards applied. Sarah packed her belongings methodically, taking only what she would need for the next 6 months. Most of her possessions went into storage. She kept her flight gear, some books, running shoes, and enough civilian clothes for the rare occasions when she wouldn't be in uniform. Everything else was excess weight she didn't need. The drive back took most of a day. Sarah used the time to think about what lay ahead and what she wanted to accomplish. Fighter weapons school would give her the opportunity to learn from the absolute best pilots and tacticians in the Air Force. But more than that, it would give her the credentials and knowledge to become an instructor herself, shaping the next generation of fighter pilots. That responsibility weighed on Sarah's mind. If she succeeded at weapons school, she would return to the operational Air Force with the authority and expertise to teach others. Her words and methods would influence how young pilots thought about air combat. She would have the power to either perpetuate the old attitudes that had made her own path so difficult, or to create a more inclusive environment that judged pilots purely on their abilities. Sarah arrived on a Sunday evening. The base looked the same as it had a month ago, but her perspective had changed. Last time she had been an unknown quantity, facing skepticism and doubt. This time she was arriving as a recognized performer with a documented track record. The pressure would be different but no less intense. Fighter weapons school classes started with 24 students. Sarah was one of 2 women in the group, the other being a helicopter pilot named Jennifer Park. The remaining 22 students were men from various fighter and attack aircraft communities. Some flew F-16s like Sarah. Others flew F-15s, F-22s, or A-10s. Each brought expertise from their own platform and experience base. The first day consisted entirely of administrative processing and initial briefings. Sarah sat through hours of presentations about course standards, safety procedures, and academic expectations. The instructors made it clear from the beginning that weapons school students were held to higher standards than regular operational pilots. Perfect was the minimum acceptable performance. Anything less was grounds for extra instruction or removal from the course. The lead instructor, a colonel named Mitchell who shared Sarah's last name but no relation, addressed the class at the end of the first day. He was a legend in the fighter community, with combat experience spanning 3 decades and 2 wars. His reputation was built on uncompromising standards and a deep understanding of air combat that few could match. Colonel Mitchell looked at the assembled students with an expression that conveyed both challenge and expectation. "You're here because someone thought you had potential," he said. "But potential means nothing at weapons school. What matters is performance, day after day, under pressure and scrutiny. Some of you will not finish this course. That's not a threat, it's a statistical reality. The question you need to answer for yourself is whether you're willing to do whatever it takes to be one of the ones who does finish." Sarah listened carefully, knowing the colonel's words were directed at everyone, but also aware that as one of only 2 women in the class, she would face additional scrutiny. Every mistake every success would be questioned. She had dealt with that dynamic before and knew she could handle it again. The flying portion of the course started on day 3. Sarah was assigned to a 4-ship formation that would train together throughout the first month. Her flight lead was a major named who flew F-15Es. The other 2 pilots in the formation were both F-16 pilots like Sarah, captains named, and all 3 of the men had strong operational backgrounds and reputations as skilled pilots. Their first sortie together was a basic 4 versus 4 defensive counter-air mission. The scenario was straightforward: defend a high-value target from attacking enemy fighters. Sarah's flight would work as a team, coordinating their actions to maximize their defensive effectiveness. The scenario had been flown thousands of times by previous weapons school classes, with every possible variation documented and analyzed. Briefed the mission in excruciating detail, covering contingencies and backup plans that seemed excessive to Sarah. But she quickly realized that this level of planning was standard at weapons school. Nothing was left to chance. Every pilot needed to know exactly what to do in any situation that might arise. Mission itself went reasonably well. Sarah's flight successfully defended the target, shooting down 3 of the 4 attacking aircraft. But the debrief afterward was brutal. The instructors picked apart every decision, every maneuver, every radio call. What Sarah had thought was a successful mission was revealed to have numerous flaws and missed opportunities. The instructors used video footage and computer data to illustrate each point, making their criticisms impossible to dismiss or argue against. Took the criticism professionally acknowledging the mistakes and discussing how the flight could improve. Sarah followed his example, accepting the feedback without defensiveness. Seemed frustrated but controlled it well. Appeared genuinely shocked by how much criticism they received for what seemed like a successful mission. This pattern repeated over the following weeks. Each mission grew progressively more complex, with more aircraft involved and more challenging scenarios. The debrief after each flight was a master class in tactical analysis, with instructors breaking down every aspect of the mission and identifying areas for improvement. Sarah learned more about air combat in those first few weeks than she had in years of operational flying. The academic workload was equally intense. Every evening, students were required to study thick manuals covering fighter tactics, weapons employment, threat systems, and operational planning. There were written tests almost every week, with passing scores set at 90% or higher. Students who failed tests were given one opportunity to retest. A second failure meant removal from the course. Sarah developed a study routine that worked for her. She would fly during the day, debrief for hours, grab a quick dinner, then study until midnight or later. Sleep became a precious commodity measured in hours rather than quality. She survived on coffee, energy bars, and the determination to not be the one who washed out. 6 weeks into the course, the first student quit. He was an F-22 pilot who had seemed confident and capable, but couldn't handle the sustained pressure. He turned in his materials one morning and was gone by that afternoon. His departure served as a reminder to everyone else that weapons school was not something you could coast through on talent alone. It required absolute commitment and the ability to perform under constant evaluation. Sarah's flight was tasked with planning and executing a major offensive counter-air mission in Week 8. They would lead a package of 16 aircraft against a heavily defended target, coordinating fighters, bombers, electronic warfare aircraft, and tankers. The mission planning alone took 3 days, with every detail scrutinized by the instructors before approval. Assigned Sarah to lead one of the 4 ship elements that would sweep ahead of the strike package and clear a path through enemy fighters. It was a critical role that required aggressive tactics and precise timing. If Sarah's element failed to eliminate the defending fighters, the entire strike package would be at risk. She spent an entire evening planning her element's specific tactics, considering every possible enemy response and developing contingency plans, and would fly as her wingman, following her lead and providing mutual support. The third pilot in her element was a captain named who flew A-10s in his operational unit, but was flying F-16s during the weapons school course. The mission launched on a clear morning with perfect flying weather. Sarah's element took off first, climbing rapidly to altitude while the rest of the package formed up behind them. The radio frequency was disciplined and professional, with pilots making only essential calls. Everything they said was being recorded for later analysis in the debrief. Sarah led her element toward the target area at high speed, using terrain masking to avoid early detection. Her radar showed multiple enemy contacts ahead, positioned to intercept the strike package. She made a quick assessment of the situation and decided to split her element into 2 pairs. She would engage the northern group of defenders and handled the southern group. The split maneuver worked perfectly. Sarah's pair achieved surprise on the northern defenders, shooting down 2 enemy fighters before they could react effectively. Stayed in perfect position, covering Sarah's attacks and then pressing his own when opportunities arose. The coordination between them was seamless, the product of weeks of training together, and had similar success in the south, eliminating 3 defenders and forcing the remainder to retreat. Sarah's element had cleared the path for the strike package, allowing the bombers to reach their targets and complete their simulated attacks. The mission was a success by any objective measure. But the debrief still lasted over 4 hours. The instructors praised the overall execution while identifying dozens of small details that could have been done better. Sarah accepted the feedback and took careful notes. She was learning to see her own performance through the eyes of experts who could identify flaws invisible to less experienced pilots. Colonel Mitchell attended the debrief for this mission, a sign that it was considered particularly important. He waited until the tactical instructors had finished their analysis before speaking. His words were measured and deliberate. "What you accomplished today was solid weapons school-level work," he said, looking at Sarah's element. "Mitchell, your decision to split the formation showed good tactical judgment. The execution from all 4 of you was clean and effective." He paused, and Sarah knew there was more coming. However, I want you to think about what would have happened if the enemy had positioned one more aircraft in a place you didn't check. All your planning and execution would have been for nothing if you had missed a single threat. Sarah nodded, understanding the point. Good performance was not the same as perfect performance, and perfect was what weapons school demanded. There was always another layer of analysis, another contingency to consider, another way the enemy might surprise you. Constant vigilance and detailed planning were not optional extras but fundamental requirements for survival in modern air combat. The course continued its relentless pace. More missions, more tests, more late nights studying complex material. Sarah lost track of what day of the week it was, living in a constant present tense where the only things that mattered were the next sortie and the next exam. She grew thinner and more exhausted, but also more capable and confident in ways she had not been before. Jennifer Park, the other woman in the class, was struggling with the academic workload. She was an excellent pilot but had not had to take written tests in years. The constant examinations and the high passing standards were wearing her down. Sarah tried to help when she could, sharing study techniques and offering encouragement. But ultimately, each student had to find their own way through the course. Park failed an exam on threat systems in week 10. She was given a retest opportunity 1 week later. Sarah could see the stress building on Park's face as the retest date approached. The pressure of knowing that one more failure would end her weapons school journey was crushing. Sarah had been there herself during flight school and knew there were no words that could really help. Park passed the retest with a score of exactly 90%, the minimum required. The relief on her face was visible to everyone in the classroom. She had survived the immediate crisis, but the pressure would not let up. There were still 2 months of course remaining with more tests and more opportunities to fail. In week 12, the class flew a massive force-on-force exercise involving over 50 aircraft. It was the largest and most complex scenario of the course, designed to test everything the students had learned. Sarah was assigned to lead an 8-ship formation of fighters tasked with protecting a high-value airborne asset from enemy attackers. The scenario would last over 2 hours and cover hundreds of miles of airspace. The mission planning took a full week. Sarah and the other formation leaders coordinated their tactics, established communication protocols, and wargamed dozens of possible enemy courses of action. The instructors watched the planning process closely, occasionally asking pointed questions that forced the students to reconsider their assumptions. The night before the mission, Sarah reviewed her notes one final time. She had memorized the plan, but repetition helped cement the details in her mind. She knew from experience that under the stress of combat, even simulated combat, it was easy to forget things. The more deeply ingrained the plan was, the more likely she would execute it correctly when the pressure was highest. The mission was chaos from the start. Enemy aircraft appeared from unexpected directions, forcing Sarah's formation to adapt on the fly. Communications became cluttered as multiple formations tried to coordinate their actions while under attack. The high-value asset they were supposed to protect maneuvered unpredictably, making it difficult to maintain proper defensive positioning. Sarah fell back on her training and instincts. She kept her formation together through aggressive maneuvering, engaging threats as they appeared while never losing sight of the primary mission. Her wingmen followed her lead, maintaining discipline despite the chaos around them. When one section of her formation got separated during a particularly intense engagement, Sarah quickly reorganized the remaining aircraft and continued the mission. The scenario ended with the high-value asset successfully completing its mission, though Sarah's formation had taken heavy losses. 5 of her 8 aircraft had been shot down, including Sarah herself in the final minutes. But they had accomplished the objective, and the debrief would determine whether their tactics and decision-making met weapons school standards. The debrief lasted 6 hours, the longest of the entire course. Every formation leader had to present their analysis of what happened, what went well, and what could have been done better. Sarah's turn came third. She stood at the front of the room with video footage playing on the large screen behind her, showing key moments from her formation's fight. She walked through her decision-making process, explaining why she had positioned her aircraft where she did, and how she had responded to unexpected enemy actions. The instructors asked probing questions, challenging some of her choices and forcing her to defend her reasoning. Sarah responded confidently, but without arrogance, acknowledging mistakes while standing behind the decisions she still believed were correct. Colonel Mitchell asked the final question. You lost 5 of 8 aircraft. Was that an acceptable exchange given the mission objective? Sarah considered the question carefully. Sir, I would never call losing aircraft acceptable, but given the scenario parameters and the enemy force we faced, I believe the casualty rate was within the expected range for this type of mission. More importantly, we accomplished the objective, which was to protect the high-value asset. In a real combat situation, that success would have justified the losses. Mitchell nodded slowly. That's a mature assessment. The reality of modern air combat is that we may face situations where casualties are inevitable. The question is whether those casualties purchase something valuable enough to justify the cost. He paused, looking at Sarah directly. You made hard calls under pressure today. Some of them were exactly right. Some of them could have been better, but you never hesitated or froze, and your formation stayed in the fight until the end. That's what we need from weapons school graduates. The weeks continued to pass in a blur of flying, studying, and debriefing. Sarah's skills sharpened to a fine edge. She could visualize air combat scenarios in 3 dimensions, anticipating how situations would develop and planning responses before threats fully materialized. The constant evaluation that had been so stressful at the beginning became normal, just another part of the training environment. In week 16, Jennifer Park failed another exam. This time it was on operational planning, a complex subject that required integrating multiple different specialties and considerations. Park took the retest 2 days later and failed again. Her journey at fighter weapons school was over. She packed her belongings quietly and left the base within 24 hours. Sarah felt the loss personally. Park had been more than just the other woman in the class. She had become a friend and study partner. Her departure meant Sarah was now the only woman remaining in a class that had already lost 6 students to various failures and eliminations. The weight of being the last one standing pressed heavily on Sarah's shoulders. But there was no time to dwell on it. The course was entering its final phase, with the most challenging missions and most comprehensive exams still ahead. Sarah threw herself into the work with renewed determination. She would finish the course, not just for herself, but for all the women who would come after her. She would prove that success at fighter weapons school had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with skill, dedication, and mental toughness. The final exercise of the course was a 3-day campaign scenario that simulated a sustained combat operation. Students planned and flew multiple missions per day, working with minimal sleep and maximum pressure. The scenario was designed to test whether students could maintain performance standards when physically exhausted and mentally drained. It was the ultimate evaluation of everything weapons school taught. Sarah flew 6 missions over 3 days, leading different formations on each sortie. She planned strikes, coordinated with other aircraft, and engaged enemy fighters while juggling fuel management, weapons conservation, and communication with multiple agencies. Between missions, she grabbed a few hours of sleep and studied mission results to improve performance on the next sortie. By the 3rd day, Sarah was operating on pure discipline and muscle memory. Her body screamed for rest. Her mind felt foggy and slow. But she pushed through, knowing that real combat would be even more demanding. Fighter pilots didn't get to take breaks because they were tired. They kept flying and fighting until the mission was complete or they ran out of aircraft. The final mission of the course was a long-range strike deep into enemy territory. Sarah led a 4-ship formation escorting bombers against a heavily defended target. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Tankers were delayed, forcing fuel calculations to be redone in flight. Enemy fighters appeared in unexpected numbers. Weather obscured the target area, requiring last-minute adjustments to the attack plan. Sarah coordinated responses to each problem as it arose, never losing focus on the ultimate objective. Her formation adapted to the changing situation, maintaining discipline and effectiveness despite the chaos. When they finally reached the target area, the bombers completed their attack runs while Sarah's fighters kept enemy defenders at bay. The mission was successful, though just barely. She landed back with her fuel gauge showing almost empty and her body shaking from exhaustion. The ground crew helped her out of the cockpit because her legs would not support her weight. She sat on the ground for several minutes, just breathing and letting her body recover from the sustained stress. The final debrief for the course was held the next day, after students had a chance to rest and recover. Colonel Mitchell conducted the debrief personally, reviewing the entire 3-day exercise and highlighting key learning points. He showed video footage of both successful and unsuccessful missions, using the examples to reinforce tactical principles that had been taught throughout the course. Then he announced the class rankings. Students were evaluated on their overall performance across all flying missions and academic tests. The rankings would follow them throughout their careers, marking them as graduates of fighter weapons school and indicating how well they had performed relative to their peers. Sarah finished fourth in a class of 18 graduates. 6 students had washed out at various points during the course, unable to meet the demanding standards. But 18 had persevered, completing every requirement and demonstrating the skills and knowledge expected of weapons school graduates. Sarah had proven she belonged among them, earning her place through performance that spoke for itself. The graduation ceremony was held on the last Friday of the course. Family members and unit commanders attended to watch their pilots receive their weapons school patches. Sarah's parents had flown in from Montana, her father wearing his best suit and her mother wiping away proud tears. They had supported her dream of flying from the beginning, and now they were here to see her achieve one of the highest honors in military aviation. Colonel Mitchell presented each graduate with their patch personally, shaking hands and saying a few words to each one. When Sarah's turn came, Mitchell held her patch for a moment before handing it over. "You did good work here, Lieutenant," he said. "But more importantly, you showed other people it was possible. That matters more than you might realize." Sarah accepted the patch and saluted. "Thank you, sir. I won't forget what I learned here." "I know you won't," Mitchell replied. "Now go teach others. That's the real purpose of all this." The reception after the ceremony was crowded and loud. Sarah's parents met some of her classmates and instructors, clearly proud, but also a bit overwhelmed by the military environment. Sarah introduced them to and her formation partners throughout the course. Both men had become genuine friends, moving past any initial skepticism to respect based on shared experience and performance. The major who had been her flight lead during the first month found Sarah during the reception. "I wanted to say congratulations before you leave," he said. "You earned every bit of that patch. Don't let anyone tell you different." Sarah smiled. "I learned a lot flying with you. Thanks for being a good instructor." Shook his head. "I wasn't trying to instruct. I was trying to keep up. You're going to do great things in this Air Force, Mitchell. I'm glad I got to see the beginning of it." As the reception wound down and people started leaving, Sarah stood outside the building and looked out at the flight line. F-16s and F-15s sat in neat rows, ready for tomorrow's missions. The desert sky was turning orange and purple as the sun set behind the mountains. This place had tested her like nothing else in her life, pushing her to limits she didn't know she had. But she had survived. More than that, she had excelled. The 4th highest-ranked graduate in her class, with a fighter weapons school patch now sewn onto her flight suit. She had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that she belonged among the Air Force's elite fighter pilots. The mockery and doubt from months ago seemed like ancient history now. Her new assignment would take her back to an operational squadron as a weapons and tactics officer. She would be responsible for training other pilots, developing new tactics, and maintaining the unit's combat readiness. It was a position of responsibility and authority that would allow her to shape how the next generation of pilots thought about air combat. Sarah thought about what Colonel Mitchell had said about showing others it was possible. She understood now that her journey had never been just about her own success. Every barrier she broke, every standard she met, every skeptic she proved wrong, it all made the path a little bit easier for the women who would follow. That responsibility was both heavy and motivating. Her father approached as she stood there watching the sunset. He was a man of few words who had taught Sarah to let actions speak louder than anything she could say. He stood next to her in silence for a moment, looking out at the same scene. "Your mother wants to take pictures," he finally said. "You know how she gets." Sarah smiled. "Yeah, I know." Her father hesitated, then added, "I'm proud of you, Sarah, not just for this, but for how you got here. You never quit, even when people told you that you should. That takes a special kind of stubborn." Sarah felt her eyes start to water. "I learned that from you, Dad. Watching you work the farm all those years, dealing with bad weather and worse prices, never complaining or giving up. You showed me what real toughness looks like." Her father nodded, uncomfortable with the emotional moment but clearly moved. "Come on, let's go find your mother before she starts crying in front of all these military folks." The next morning, Sarah packed her rental car for the drive to her new assignment. She had said her goodbyes to classmates the night before, exchanging contact information and promises to stay in touch. Some of those promises would be kept. Others would fade as everyone got busy with their new responsibilities. That was the nature of military life, constantly forming and breaking connections as people moved through their careers. As Sarah drove away she looked in the mirror at the base growing smaller behind her. 6 months ago, she had arrived there facing doubt and skepticism. She was leaving as a fighter weapons school graduate, carrying knowledge and skills that would serve her throughout her career. The journey had been harder than anything she had previously experienced, but it had also been exactly what she needed. The story of the pilot who shot down 12 jets in an F-16 had grown in the telling, spreading through the fighter community and beyond. Some versions of the story were reasonably accurate. Others had turned it into something closer to legend than fact. Sarah didn't bother trying to correct the exaggerations. The story had taken on a life of its own, serving a purpose larger than simple accuracy. What mattered was that young women considering military aviation careers now had an example to point to. They could say that a female fighter pilot had not just succeeded, but excelled at the highest levels of the profession. They could prove with documented facts that gender had nothing to do with the ability to fly and fight. That was worth more than any amount of personal recognition or fame. Sarah drove through the Nevada desert with the sun rising behind her, heading toward whatever came next. There would be more challenges, more skeptics to prove wrong, more barriers to break, but she was ready for all of it. Fighter weapons school had refined her skills and hardened her determination. She knew now with absolute certainty that she could handle whatever the Air Force and her career threw at her. The road ahead stretched out empty and straight, disappearing into the distance. Sarah pushed down on the accelerator and settled in for the long drive. She had miles to go before she reached her destination, but for the first time in a long time, she felt completely confident about the direction she was heading. The doubters had laughed at her skills. She had responded by shooting down their assumptions along with those simulated enemy jets. And in the end, that was all that really mattered, not the number of kills or the class ranking or the patch on her flight suit. What mattered was that she had proven beyond any doubt that she belonged exactly where she was. The rest was just noise that would fade away with time, leaving behind only the facts of what she had accomplished and the example she had set for those who would follow. Up and do it all again tomorrow, because that's what fighter pilots did. They flew, they fought, they pushed themselves to the absolute limits, and then they got up the next day and did it again. And Sarah Mitchell had proven she could do that as well as anyone who had ever strapped into a cockpit. The last thing Victoria thought before sleep took her was that maybe, just maybe, she could learn to be someone different. Someone better. Someone who didn't need to break things to be heard.